The palace of the Zelari queen stood tall above the clouds, shining like glass and gold. Inside, alien servants walked quickly, silent and alert. They were preparing for something rare. A human male had been summoned by royal command. His name was Daniel Reese, a former Earth engineer turned deep space survivor. He walked through the giant crystal halls.com, hands in his pockets, eyes watching everything. To the guards, he looked weak, soft, too relaxed for someone about to meet the queen of a warrior race. But Daniel wasn't like most people. He had survived worse things than royal threats, and he didn't fear anyone, not even a queen. The chamber doors opened, and the smell of incense hit him. The room was huge, filled with light and warmth. Cushions and silk draped from the walls, and there she was, Queen Saraxa of the Zelari. Sitting on a throne made from starlight metal, tall, powerful, her skin shimmered like silver fire. Her long tendrils curled around her shoulders like living ribbons. She looked at Daniel with cold amusement, tapping her long fingers on the throne's edge. "So," she said, her voice smooth like smoke, "this is the human everyone speaks of." Daniel tilted his head. "Guess so." A murmur ran through her advisors, shocked at his lack of respect. But the queen raised a hand, silencing them. With a flick of her wrist, "You are here because I chose you," she said. "Your DNA is strong, your body." "Acceptable?" Daniel didn't answer. She continued. "You will sign the reproductive agreement, become my seed carrier, and in return, your species will gain royal favor." Daniel walked forward, slow and steady, until he stood just below the throne. He looked up at her not with lust, not with fear, but with calm curiosity. "And what do I get?" he asked, "other than being used like a breeding machine?" Gasps echoed across the room. Some guards tightened their grips on their weapons. One advisor whispered, "Arrogant primate." But Queen Saraxa only leaned forward, her golden eyes narrowing. "You get survival. A human," she said. "You get a place in history." Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "I make my own place," he said quietly. "Don't need anyone's throne to stand tall." The queen stood, her silver robes flowing behind her. She was nearly a foot taller than him, and her voice now had steel in it. "Are you rejecting the honor?" Daniel shrugged. "I'm rejecting the way it's forced." For a moment, no one moved. Then the queen's expression changed, not anger, not rage, but something else, curiosity, maybe even interest. She turned away, walking to a small table, covered in glowing symbols. From it, she picked up a long scroll, the royal contract. Thick with laws and ancient rites, she walked back to him and dropped it at his feet. "Sign it," she said, "or return to Earth with nothing." Daniel picked it up, turned the pages slowly, pretending to read. Then he looked back up at her, and something shifted in the air. Without warning, he tore the scroll right down the middle, ripping it in two with both hands. The entire room froze. Gasps, then silence, then the sound of guards stepping forward. "Enough?" the queen shouted, raising her voice for the first time. The guards stopped, unsure, staring at her. Queen Saraxa walked back to her throne slowly, her eyes locked on Daniel the whole time. She sat down, crossed her legs, and rested her chin on one hand. "Very well," she said, a strange smile on her lips. "Let the humans stay," an advisor hissed. "But your majesty, he destroyed royal law." "Let him stay," she repeated, louder. "I want to see what happens next." Daniel didn't smile this time. He simply turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving the torn contract on the floor. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The queen watched him go, her thoughts racing. For years, no one had dared to defy her. But now she wasn't angry. She was interested. And interest from a Zelari queen was more dangerous than war. Daniel stood on the balcony of the chamber given to him, the stars above glowing like cold fire. The room was royal. Yes, but it felt more like a golden cage than a home. Silk drapes floated in the air. Sweet scents drifted in from hidden vents. And alien music played softly in the background. But Daniel didn't relax. He knew these luxuries weren't a gift. They were meant to make him forget what had just happened, to tame him. He stepped away from the window and looked at the door solid. Sealed, no handle on the inside. Locked, of course. He let out a breath. Sat on the floor, instead of the ornate bed, and leaned back against the wall. His mind was still playing back the look in the Queen's eyes when he tore that scroll. She hadn't expected it, not even a little. She thought he would fold, like every other male that came before her, but he hadn't, and now she was watching him closely. Later that evening, a young alien girl entered the room quietly. Holding a tray of food, she didn't speak right away, just set the tray down and started to leave. But Daniel looked up and said gently, "Do you have a name?" The girl paused, surprised, then whispered, "Rinya," without turning around. He nodded. "Thanks, Rinya." She turned, clearly confused. "No one thanks servants here," she said softly, "especially not guests like you," he smiled. "A little, then maybe someone should." Rinya looked at him a moment longer, then leaned in and whispered, "Be careful, human. The Queen doesn't forgive disrespect." Then she was gone, the door sealing shut behind her. Daniel waited until the food got cold before he touched it, not because he was afraid of poison, but because he was thinking about Rinia's warning, the locked door, the soft bed, and the Queen's strange smile. He wasn't just a guest here. He was being studied, tested, maybe even toyed with the next day. He was invited to the Queen's garden, a place said to grow only the rarest plants in the galaxy. But it wasn't the flowers he noticed, it was the Queen herself, sitting under a tree of glowing blue petals, waiting for him like a spider in the center of her web. He walked slowly, not bowing, not hesitating, just meeting her eyes as he sat. Across from her on the stone bench, she didn't speak at first, just watched him as the wind moved her silver hair like it had a life of its own. Finally, she said, "Why did you tear the contract?" Daniel replied, "Because it wasn't a choice, it was a command wrapped in gold." She studied him. "Most males would be honored to receive my command. I'm not most males," he said calmly. She leaned forward, the space between them charged with tension. "You understand, human, that no one defies the Queen of the Zelari and walks away free?" Daniel nodded. "That's why I'm still here, isn't it?" "You don't want me to walk away?" The Queen smiled, slow and dangerous, but not unkind. "No," she said. "I want to see what you do when no one is holding your leash." Suddenly, 2 guards arrived, dragging in another male reptilian. Alien with bruises on his face, the Queen stood and turned to the guards. "This one refused his contract," she said, "just like you." She looked at Daniel. "Tell me, what should I do with him?" Daniel looked at the injured man, then back at her. "I don't tell queens what to do," he said. "But maybe if you listened instead of ordered, you wouldn't have to force anyone." There was silence, cold and heavy. Even the birds in the garden stopped singing. The Queen walked slowly toward Daniel, her expression unreadable. Then she stopped inches from him and said, "You may go." Daniel stood up, calm as ever, and walked past her without looking back. The guards opened the gate without needing to be told. That night, back in his chamber, Daniel found something strange. The door wasn't locked anymore. He opened it, looked into the hallway, and saw nothing but flickering lights and long shadows. No guards, no orders, just silence. He smiled to himself. He hadn't escaped, no. He had been released, and that made things even more dangerous. Because it meant the Queen wasn't trying to control him anymore. She was trying to understand him, and that was just the beginning. The invitation came in the form of a glowing orb. No words, just a pulse that led Daniel down unknown corridors. He followed without fear, his boots echoing on the smooth crystal floor. The palace felt different this time, not like a prison, but like a stage, and tonight he was being pushed into the spotlight. The hall opened into a grand chamber filled with music and whispers. Dozens of alien nobles stood in curved rows, their eyes glowing in shades of gold, violet, and green. The queen sat at the highest table, her throne shining beneath the hanging orbs of floating fire. Daniel didn't slow down, didn't flinch. He walked straight toward the empty space beside her, and stopped one step short. Whispers rose instantly. That seat was sacred, reserved only for those chosen by the queen for pairing. Everyone expected him to sit, expected him to finally give in to the honor. But Daniel looked at the queen, then turned, and walked to the lower tables. He pulled a chair back not for himself, but for a young alien female servant who had been standing frozen at the wall. "Eat," he said gently. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." The room fell dead silent. Even the music faded. The servant girl, her eyes wide with fear, looked up at the queen, trembling. The queen didn't move, didn't speak, but she didn't stop it either. Daniel sat beside the girl and calmly picked up a piece of glowing fruit, chewing like it was just another day. Around him, nobles shifted uncomfortably, confused, offended, curious, to treat a servant like an equal. It was unthinkable, but Daniel didn't care for their rules, only his own. When the meal ended, the queen stood, her voice soft but sharp. "Tell me, human, do you think such gestures earn respect in this court?" Daniel looked up at her, calm as ever. "No," he replied, "but maybe they remind others what respect actually looks like." The queen's eyes narrowed, unreadable. Then she smiled just a little and said, "Come with me." She turned, her silver cloak whispering behind her. Daniel stood, nodded to the servant girl, and followed. She led him into a private chamber quiet, high above the rest of the palace. The stars outside were close enough to touch. She walked to a glass wall and stared out, her back to him. "You are strange," she said, her voice low. "You insult me. Yet I cannot bring myself to punish you." Daniel walked to the edge of the room, but didn't get close. "I don't insult you," he said. "I just don't worship you." She turned slowly, her eyes glowing like a storm. "And why not? Do you not see the power I hold?" He met her gaze, steady. "I see power." "Yes," he said. "But power without empathy is just fear-wearing jewelry." For the first time, her mask cracked, her smile faded. Her shoulders tensed. No one had spoken to her like that, not in years. Not ever. He wasn't asking to be equal. He already saw himself as equal. She walked toward him, slowly, carefully, like approaching a wild creature. "You risk everything with every word you speak," she said, "and yet you keep speaking." Daniel didn't move, because maybe someone needs to, he said softly, "and maybe you're finally ready to hear it." She stopped just one step away from him. He could see her eyes searching his face, not for weakness, but for truth, and what she saw there unsettled her. Not fear, not desire, but something deeper, something human. "You're dangerous," she whispered. Daniel smiled slightly. "Only if you're afraid of change." The queen turned and walked away, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Then perhaps I am." The doors behind Daniel slid open again, quietly, like the palace itself was listening. He left without another word, the stars still watching from above. The queen remained in the room standing alone, her hand reached out to the glass, touching nothing, feeling everything, and for the first time in her long, ruling life, she didn't feel sure of herself anymore. Thunder rolled through the palace, not from the sky, but from the crowd gathered in the royal hall. The Zelari people had come to witness something sacred, something that hadn't been challenged in over 500 years. The reproductive contract ceremony. This time, it was different. The guest of honor wasn't kneeling. He was standing tall, arms folded, face calm. And that alone had sent ripples through the entire room. Queen Saraxa sat upon her throne. Dressed in the ceremonial armor of her bloodline, her silver skin shimmered. Beneath the hall's blue firelight, her gaze unreadable. Beside her, on a floating crystal stand, sat the document hundreds of pages long, glowing faintly with Zelari law. Every clause, every rule, every promise carefully etched with ancient authority. Once signed, it would bind Daniel to her forever. Body, genetics, future, and legacy. A voice echoed through the hall, old and sharp. The contract has been blessed by the keepers of lineage, witnessed by the high blood houses, and reviewed by the Interstellar Council. A pause. Human, do you accept this honor? The audience turned their heads toward Daniel, waiting for him to step forward. He did, slowly, each step echoing like a countdown. When he reached the floating contract, he stared at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up, held it in both hands, and looked straight at the Queen. He didn't shout, didn't tremble, didn't make a scene. He just spoke calmly. I read every word of this, he said, twice. He held the first page between his fingers, and nowhere in this does it ask what I want. The silence that followed was thick and sharp. He looked up at the Queen. This isn't a proposal, it's a command, dressed in lace. Then, before anyone could stop him, he tore the first page clean. Down the center, the gasps came all at once, like an explosion without fire. Nobles stood in outrage. Guards gripped their weapons. A high priest fainted. But Daniel kept tearing page after page, the glowing ink turning to dust in the air. He dropped the shredded remains onto the ground, looked up, and said, no. The Queen hadn't moved, not even an inch. But her eyes burned, not with anger, but with something more dangerous thought. A single nod from her, and half the guards in the room would leap forward. But she didn't give the order. Instead, she stood, walked down the steps of her throne, and approached him in silence, face to face. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. You do realize, she whispered, that you've just broken a law older than your species' moon. Daniel didn't blink. Then maybe it was time someone did. She stared at him, and in her eyes was not rage, but curiosity. She raised her hand, and everyone tensed. But all she did was lift one torn piece of the contract and let it fall from her fingers. I could have you executed for this, she said, still calm. You could, he agreed, but then you'd prove I was right. The Queen exhaled slowly, her breath making the torn pages flutter on the floor. She turned and faced the stunned crowd. Let the court be dismissed, she said, her voice loud now, regal and steady. No contract will be signed today. Gasps again, louder, angry, confused. Advisors rushed forward, begging her to reconsider. But she raised her hand, silencing them all with one look. As the nobles slowly filed out, casting furious glances at the human who still stood proudly in the center, Daniel didn't move. He stayed until the last voice faded from the chamber. When only he and the Queen remained, she finally spoke again. I've ruled longer than your world has known peace, she said, walking back toward her throne. But today, for the first time, I feel uncertain. Daniel watched her but said nothing. She sat down, and for a moment, she didn't look like a queen. She looked like a woman, asking herself a question she'd never dared to before. And Daniel, without smiling, turned and walked out of the chamber, not as her subject, but as the first man who ever said no to a queen and lived to be heard. The Queen didn't sleep that night. She sat alone in her private chamber. No guards, no advisors, no lights, only the pale glow of the torn contract pieces floating in the air like dying embers. Her fingers touched one of the pages gently, as if she could still feel the warmth of his hands on it. She didn't understand it. Not fully, she had commanded, and he had refused. But instead of punishment, she had let him go. Why? Down in the lower levels of the palace, Daniel sat on the edge of a stone bench, his back against the cold wall. They hadn't put him back in luxury this time. No pillows, no golden chamber, just 4 walls. Dim light and silence. But he didn't mind. He knew exactly what this was. Not a prison, not a punishment, a pause. She was thinking. And thinking was dangerous for both of them. The guards didn't speak to him, not even once. But one of them left a blanket in the night, folded neatly beside the door. Daniel didn't need comfort, but he took it anyway. Not for the warmth, but for the message. Someone was watching. And not everyone wanted him dead. In the throne room, Queen Saraxa walked in circles, her bare feet quiet on the crystal floor. She remembered how confident she had felt when she summoned him. Another strong male with good genetics, another name, to write into the royal history. But now, it wasn't his body that intrigued her. It was his voice, his refusal, his calm defiance. He hadn't begged, hadn't even flinched. And worse, he had made her feel something she didn't know how to name. In the morning, she called her advisors. They argued for hours, shouting about law, honor, appearance. One demanded Daniel be executed before the other species thought the queen was growing weak. Another suggested forcing a new contract and silencing the story. But she said nothing, just listened until one advisor said the wrong thing. He is a human, my queen, lesser, emotional, prideful, a danger to our purity. That's when she stood, walked across the room, and slapped the advisor so hard he fell to the floor. The room went silent. We do not speak of others like animals, she said coldly. Not in my court. No one argued after that night. She went to the cell herself, alone, without guards. Daniel looked up as the door slid open, but he didn't stand. He just watched her step inside like a storm wrapped in silk. She didn't speak right away. She looked around the small room. As if shocked by its emptiness, this cell was built for traitors. She finally said, not for guests. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Is that what I am now? A guest again? She ignored the question, walking closer until only one breath separated them. You broke the law, she said, but you made the court listen. Daniel didn't blink. I didn't do it for them. Then why? She asked. Softer now. Why stand against everything I am? He looked up at her, tired but still unbroken. Because I don't believe in queens who take without asking. Silence stretched between them. The queen looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to ask. Daniel stood. Now, slow, steady, and looked her in the eyes. Then maybe start there, he said. Before trying to take anything else, she stared at him like she was seeing something new, something raw and real. Then she did something no one in the palace had seen her do in decades. She stepped back, bowed her head slightly, and left without a word. Daniel sat back down slowly. Breathing in the quiet, he didn't smile, but something in his chest felt lighter. The war between them wasn't over, but maybe the rules were starting to change, and in the highest tower, the queen stood at her window, staring into the stars. A question sat in her heart now, louder than any law. Was it possible? She didn't want obedience, but something real. The palace had grown quieter over the last few days. It wasn't a silence of peace, but of waiting. Rumors drifted through the corridors like smoke servants, whispering about the human who tore the sacred contract and still breathed. Some called him mad, some called him brave, but all agreed on one thing: something was changing, and no one knew which way it would turn in the gardens. A group of lower caste Selari gathered under the light of the twin moons. They spoke in hushed tones. Nervously glancing at the guards, one of them, an old woman with tired eyes, whispered, "Did you see what he did?" "No chains, no begging." Another nodded. "He looked the queen in the eyes and walked away free." A third, younger and shaking, said, "I refused my pairing last week. They didn't punish me." The others froze. Something had begun to spread. Not rebellion, not yet, but courage in a dark hallway above. Queen Syraxa stood alone, watching through a hidden window. She had heard the stories, seen the shift in the air. And she knew exactly where it began. One torn contract, now door casts. Were speaking, asking, wondering. She didn't know whether to stop it or let it grow. And worse, she didn't know what she wanted anymore. Below? Daniel walked freely now. The guards still watched him, but no one tried to stop him. The palace no longer treated him as property. Not quite as a guest, something in between. He explored the archives, studied their customs, learned their language more deeply and quietly. Aliens began approaching him, not nobles, but those who had never been allowed to speak their minds. A servant girl gave him fruit and whispered, "You gave us hope." A boy from the kitchens bowed and said, "My father thanks you." He was saved from a forced match. Daniel never asked for thanks. He only listened and sometimes nodded. But he knew what was happening. He hadn't come to change their world. But it was changing anyway. Later that evening, the queen summoned him again, not to the throne room, but to the observatory. The room was quiet, surrounded by glass. Stars pouring light from every angle. Daniel entered without ceremony, without fear. She stood with her back to him, arms crossed, looking out at the sky. "When I was young," she said, "I believed strength meant silence. Obedience, tradition." He stayed quiet, waiting. "But when you tore that contract," she continued, "you didn't just challenge me. You woke something." Daniel stepped closer. "What is it you really want, Syraxa?" The use of her name made her shoulders stiffen, but she didn't stop him. She turned, her face softer than he'd ever seen. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's what scares me." He nodded slowly. "It's okay to not know. Long as you're willing to ask." She looked at him for a long time. "No mask, no throne." "I want to try," she said finally, "not as a queen, but as myself." The stars above flickered gently, as if hearing her words, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. No law, no crown, just two beings in a quiet room. Unsure of the next step, but ready to take it together, outside. In the city beyond the palace, word began to spread like wildfire. The queen had changed, not because of war or blood or fear, but because one human refused to be owned. Morning light touched the edge of the palace, softer than usual. There was no grand fanfare, no royal announcement, but across the throne hall, aliens gathered not out of fear or duty, but curiosity. Whispers floated like feathers. "The queen is calling the court again. They say the human will stand beside her. No contracts this time, no binding scrolls." Daniel stood in the corridor just behind the throne chamber, dressed simply, not in armor, not in silk. He didn't look like a royal consort, and that was the point. Today wasn't about tradition. Today was about choice. Queen Syraxa stood already in the center, her silver hair pulled back, no crown on her head. She wore a long robe of midnight blue, not royal red. Not the armor of her ancestors. It was quiet, and her voice was calm but strong when she spoke. "For generations, we ruled by paper and pressure," she said. "We told ourselves it was honor when it was control." Some nobles shifted uncomfortably, but none interrupted. "Then came a man," she continued, "who said no." Her eyes met Daniel's across the chamber, and she held the gaze. He refused what others accepted. He tore what others feared. He reminded me that power means nothing without respect. A deep silence followed her words. Then, slowly, she turned and held out her hand toward Daniel. No scroll, no law, no demand, just her open hand. Daniel stepped forward. Every eye watching. Some in shock, some in awe. When he reached her, he looked not at the crowd but at her. "What is this?" he asked quietly, so only she could hear. Her answer was soft. A question, he smiled gently. Then placed his hand in hers. Then, "My answer is yes." Gasps rang out not because he accepted, but because no one had ever been asked before. The Queen didn't declare ownership, didn't claim his name. Instead, she looked out at the court and said one simple thing. "This is the new way, not because I command it, but because I believe in it." And with that, she turned and walked forward, hand in hand with the man who defied her. Some nobles stood frozen. Others bowed without being told. Servants smiled behind curtains. The wind outside shifted direction. In the following days, the shift spread faster than law. Lower caste aliens demanded the right to refuse forced pairings. Young warriors chose their partners not based on breeding rank, but on trust. Even rival kingdoms sent messages asking if the rumors were true that the Queen had changed, that she had chosen a human, not with force, but with freedom. Daniel didn't move into the Queen's chambers. Instead, he stayed in the old stone room he had once been locked in. By choice, it reminded him of who he was and who he had helped her become. Sometimes at night, she would visit. No guards. Number orders, no expectations. They would sit by the window in silence, just watching the stars. And when she leaned her head on his shoulder, it wasn't because she was a queen, but because she was finally just Saraxa. Not every alien understood the change, not all approved, but none could deny it. The world was different now. And it all started when one man shredded a contract and offered his hand instead.